All right. Well, everyone, good morning and welcome to Keeping Career Connections at Home webinar series. My name is Michael Manzano and I'm with Career Connection at Bow Valley College, and it's great that you can join us today on another wonderful, beautiful social distancing day. Now, we've been doing these webinars throughout April and also into the start of March to help you connect with those kinds of resources and help you to get that information on different topics so that you can make those educated decisions. You can get that right information, and whether you're in your job search, whether you're working in your business, and we're trying to help you get all those right resources and connections so that you can make those right decisions. Now, I've got a couple ground rules here. Everyone's going to respect each other. I've turned off everyone's microphone so that we just don't get that kind of feedback. But you know what? Also, join in, have fun, use that chat box. If you're brave enough at the end, we've got a Q&A session, and then you can turn on your microphone and ask those questions. Now, let me tell you this. I mean, things have been very different these days, and everyone's been affected, not just in our country or in our community, but of course, throughout the entire world. Now, if you're a business owner or you know someone with a business, then this must be quite difficult for you. So, I mean, what rights do you have as a business owner? And maybe even as an employee, what rights do you have? And how do you navigate this time with all that's going on? Now, to answer these questions and to bring some clarity on what's happening, then we have two amazing lawyers from Mathews Dinsdale and Clark with us. First of all, we've got Lori Brienza, and she works with clients in a variety of sectors to achieve practical workplace solutions and manage risk. So in doing so, she provides advice to employers on all aspects of the workplace relationship, including recruitment, hiring, discipline, dismissals, disability management, health and safety workers' compensation, grievances, and other labor relations matters. And we also have on your screen on the left, we've got Wilson Chan, who's an experienced litigator who has focused his practice on all aspects of the employee-employer relationship. Now, this includes conducting workplace investigations, advising employers on workplace law, and representing companies in wrongful dismissal claims, as well as workers' compensation and OH&S matters, labor board and grievance arbitrations, and human rights and privacy complaints. So in general, just to sum it all up, they know their stuff. Now, it's great if you see them on your screen, you see they've got that social distancing, so it's great. And in the middle there, they've got the Lysol wipe. So I'm glad to see that you're following rules, Lori and Wilson. So let me pass it over to you guys, and why don't you tell us what this Employer's Guide to COVID-19 is and how we can navigate these times.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. That was a great introduction, and it's great to see everyone here today, virtually at least. Can't really see you, but I can see the numbers moving up. I noticed at the beginning when we asked about what you're looking forward to the most opening, no one said law firms. That's unfortunate because that's what we're looking forward to. We're open, but we're all working from home, and this is one of the few times we actually meet together in the office. So I'm here with Lori Brienza, who's a partner at our firm, an associate, and we practice employment and labor law. For physically distancing right now, we're about 2 meters apart.
We are 2 meters apart.
Yeah, hold on to the tape measure. So we're a bit farther apart, but hopefully you can see us. Like I said, we practice employment and labor law, as does all of our colleagues across the country. So we are Canada's only employment management side employment labor firm that practices coast to coast. So we have offices in Calgary, Vancouver, Halifax, Toronto, Sarnia, and Sault Ste. Marie, and we can really help you anywhere across the country with whatever you need with respect to workplace law. That includes occupational health and safety, workers' compensation, employment, wrongful dismissal, employment standards, as well as day-to-day advice on how to manage your workplace. So we're employment labor lawyers, and we practice on the management side, meaning that we represent employers generally. And a lot of our presentation today will be focused on the employer side or employer point of view on things and how to reopen your business. To that end, if you could just flip the next slide, we recognize that right now is a very challenging time for a lot of businesses out there. So what our firm has done is establish a 24/7 hotline that you could call if you have questions. That number is set out there. We also have an email address that's monitored 24/7 by one of our colleagues across the country. They'll be able to respond to you right away if you do have questions. and be in touch with you to answer any concerns that you might have. So, like I said earlier, our presentation today, and I'm going a bit fast because we have a lot to cover, is focused on the employer point of view. Having said that, there probably is a lot of information that will also help you if you're an employee, or if you're a small business owner, or if you're an entrepreneur that's looking to see how you could reopen your business or launch your business given these times or these, with COVID-19. To start, as you probably know, the provincial government announced, what was it, last Thursday?
April 30th, yeah.
Yeah, it felt like a year, 100 years ago. Like every day just feels so long since the start of it. But since last Thursday, the provincial government has announced the relaunch plan or the reopening plan. To that end, we've retooled our presentation to really focus on return to work planning and what that involves. And because we promised that we would do so, we included some slides and some discussion about the various support programs that are available to businesses, given how difficult it is to understand all the different programs that are out there. Lori, I think this is your slide.
Yeah, so we're going to talk to you a little bit about the relaunch strategy. So we put the big relaunch button on the screen there, but in reality, Premier Kenney did tell us that it's going to be more of a gradual phased process. So to think of it more like a dimmer switch rather than an on-off button. So when was this announced? It was announced on April 30th. It's a multi-stage process, which is consistent with what we're seeing in various provinces across the country. And one of the first things that they did was take some preliminary immediate steps. So last weekend, May 1st, we saw increased access to the provincial parks and campsites with some restrictions. So there you go. If you want to go to Banff, there you may have the ability to do so now. May 2nd, golf courses were permitted to open. I can tell you my spouse on the 2nd booked his first tee time and is already out there swinging a club. But again, no clubhouses, no pro shops, those remain closed. And more importantly, certain scheduled non-urgent surgeries can resume now with restrictions. And there have been some restrictions lifted on certain healthcare providers like dentists, physiotherapists, chiropractors. They can go back to work as of this past Monday, provided that they follow any guidelines put out by their regulatory colleges. Okay. So you might not be able to get into your dentist yet to get a cleaning, but if you have some pretty urgent issues, they will be open to assist you. So that's what happened last weekend. And from there, we're going to be launching into 3 different stages, right? And the first stage is going to really be focused on certain retail businesses like clothing, et cetera. We're hearing that there probably is going to be a staged approach to that, where if you are a a street front business, you'll be able to open immediately. It might not mean malls right away. We're going to see daycares and summer camps opening up with limits on occupancy. This will be important to allow some relief on childcare in the days that come, and then restaurants with a limit to up to 50% capacity. During that stage, schools are going to remain closed and gatherings will still be restricted to less than 15 people. Once we get to stage 2, which is the timing of which is going to depend on the success of the first stage, we're going to really see the economy opening up more and more businesses allowed to resume operations with implementation of physical distancing and other public health requirements. At this level, you're going to see schools starting to reopen, and the gatherings, the limits on restrictions on the number of people in gatherings will be increased at that point. That's the expectation. And then the third stage is the full reopening of all businesses and services with the resumption of mass gatherings as well. So festivals, concerts, that sort of thing. Just to point out that someone did mention that they want salons to open, as do I. I am currently, I have about an inch of grace and I've got spray on right now to cover it up. So that is part of the personal services that can open as early as a week from today. So we're pretty excited to see that. This slide is really helpful. It comes from, I mean, it might be a small graphic on your screen. I hope you can see it okay. It actually comes from Alberta's relaunch document, which is available in PDF form on the Alberta government website. I like this slide because it gives you a quick glance at what kind of restrictions we're going to see maintained throughout the various stages. So the first one is pretty critical and key, that physical distancing of 2 meters that Wilson and I have right now. That is pretty fundamental because it's going to continue throughout all stages of the process, meaning that once everything is fully reopened, there's still the expectation that that kind of requirement is going to be in place. Why does that matter? Because it fundamentally changes how we interact and how we work. So if you're looking to resume business operations and you haven't yet figured out how to do it, maintaining that 2 meter distance or putting in place appropriate protective health measures, if you do, personal protective equipment, if you have to be closer than 2 meters, you're going to have to figure it out pretty quick because this is a requirement that's going to stay for a while. Other things that we're going to see through stages 1 and 2, so at least until schools open, is the encouragement to wear masks in public and the continuation of a ban on non-essential domestic travel and the isolation and quarantine requirements if you find that you have symptoms of COVID-19.
So the next slide and the next section of our presentation, we're going to focus on what return to work actually means. And essentially what that means is if you don't have a plan in place yet, you should get that in place now, or at least start considering how you can put those various steps in place so that when your time does come, you can reopen again. So what we did is we broke down our presentation to 4 essential questions that you have to ask yourself before you could reopen, or as you reopen. The first is, can you actually reopen the workplace? The second is, should you reopen the workplace? Given that there is a lot of concern out there about what this currently means and what the health climate is for your employees as well as your clients. The last is, how do you actually reopen the workplace? And the last topic discussion that we're going to have is, what are the other issues that you should consider as an employer when you do open the workplace? So the first question is, can you actually reopen the workplace? And that kind of dovetails with what Lori was saying about the government staged approach to reopening the workplaces. So the most important thing you should look at, and the most important thing you should consider, is look at government regulations, government guidelines that are published on the government website about what services are allowed to open. Are you an essential service? If you are, you're already been allowed to open with proper safety precautions in place. Are you, if you're not an essential service, do you fit into the categories provided by the government? Do you fit in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3? Even if you do fit within those various stages, are you able to comply with the government guidelines, such as the physical distancing, 2 meters, as we are, before you could actually reopen? And even if you hit all those criteria, you also have to consider whether or not you are meeting industry standards or industry requirements. So if you're in a professional body like us, or dentistry, or therapists or chiropractors, you have a governing body that may tell you whether or not you can actually reopen and how you could reopen safely. So those guidelines are really important to consider and to look at as you're planning your return to work strategy. Knowing those kind of guidelines is key, because if you don't do it, you could be subject to fines for non-compliance, or potentially a stop work order, or you might face other risks from your professional bodies as well. So that was the first question: can you actually reopen? The second one is, even if you meet all those criteria, should you reopen? And the most important consideration is whether or not you can actually open or reopen safely. And how you would do that is you would have to consider the various hierarchy of controls that are in place that ensures that you're able to protect your workers as well as yourself if you're going to be in the shop, as well as your customers. So there is a hierarchy of control, hopefully you're familiar with, but in case you're not, the most important thing is to eliminate the threat, which is COVID-19. Given that there's no vaccine presently, and probably won't be for quite some time, that just simply isn't possible. So the next thing that you would look at is how you could actually mitigate that hazard. And the first is engineered controls. Those are probably the best measures to ensure that you're able to mitigate that risk. That could be, different physical controls that could be put in place. Like if you're at a grocery store and you see the plexiglass in front of the workers, or, improved ventilation system, or physical barriers put between your cubicles for different members, or putting them in separate offices. Those are the engineered controls that you might have to consider. The second is administrative controls. Those are the controls that change the behavior of your employees and the way that you function. So that could be workplace policies, requirements to be physically distanced from each other, perhaps changing your hours of operation so that less customers come in at a time, or controlling the amount of people that come in at a time. Those are second measures that you can put in place to mitigate the risk.
So like staggering start times, for example, if you've got 5 or 6 employees that come in at 8, you might stagger them so that some come in at 8, some come in at 8:30, some come in at 9, and so their shifts are staggered a bit more, which will then translate into a shift in their lunch breaks and that sort of thing. So everyone's not confined to the same space in a short period of time.
Yeah, and that's a great example of it. And, those are the best measures to ensure that, your workplace is safe. If you can't ensure that your work is, absolutely safe through those measures, you might have to consider personal protective equipment, or PPE, to mitigate that risk. So that could be face masks, that could be hazmat suits, considering where you work and how you work, gloves, eye protection, face protection, face masks, things of that nature.
Yeah, so for nurses, hospital workers, and maybe even dentistry, right? You're looking at N95s. You might not need to go get a pile of those for your organization, but you certainly want to think about what kind of protective equipment you need to eliminate or reduce that hazard.
And I did hear a question yesterday, actually, on CBC Radio about if you're opening a salon, how do you ensure that you're physically safe? And that is really difficult because you have to touch the person, and you have to actually be there in close proximity with members of the public. And through the various controls, engineered controls, administrative controls, you might want to consider limiting the amount of people that come to your salon at a time. But you might also want to consider face masks or gloves or sanitation or a shield if you can. So that's how you would address that risk. So how do you decide which measures are appropriate? What we would say, and what you would probably be obligated to do, going back a bit, even if you met all the government criterias, there's a general obligation to ensure that your workers are safe. That's Section 3 of the Occupational Health and Safety Code. And you have to do you have to do your own due diligence to make sure that workers are safe. And how you would do that is likely daily hazard assessment. So that's assessing the risk on a daily basis, deciding on how those risks can be mitigated, either through the various measures that we just briefly talked about, or the measures that are on our slides there, health screenings, mandatory isolation for those that are infected, physical distancing, sanitation, hygiene, engineering controls, PPE, things of that nature. Occupational health and safety will want to see that you've done this hazard assessment and you've come up with different controls in order to eliminate or mitigate the risk.
So obviously the biggest risk from a occupational health and safety perspective is actually contracting COVID-19 and spreading COVID-19. But I just want to also point out an additional risk that you should be thinking about as well, which is employee health and wellness, right? So there's a lot of health and wellness issues arising because of COVID-19, and the Alberta government in recent years has really emphasized that workplace mental health as part of the workplace safety requirements. And so that obligation is pretty critical now. So, when you're looking at return to work, you might think of a welcome back kit with frequently asked questions, maybe pandemic essentials, but really focusing on, or maybe an EAP program, but really focusing on the mental health element of all of this too.
And EAP is an employee assistance program.
Yeah.
It could be also EFAP, or Employee Family Assistance Program. This is a list of various measures that you might want to include as examples of controls that might limit the risk to your workplace. We've discussed a lot of it, limiting the number of employees, contractors, other staff in the workplace. So that doesn't just mean the number of people being in the workplace, but perhaps, how many are at time or at various choke points, including elevators, lunch rooms, staffing rooms. You can physically distance them. That's an example of the control. Creating various barriers, administrative controls, as we've discussed. Encouraging and reminding workers to, practice strong hygiene, Lysol, hand sanitizer, that kind of nature, of things of that nature. And also, if someone is sick, encourage them to go home, encourage them to report it and not to hide it. So those are things that you should consider how you can build that kind of not only control, but a practice, a culture in your workplace to make sure that everyone's returning to work safely.
And it all really depends on what the nature of your business is. And we all learn from each other. So, you'll all start seeing in your email inboxes various emails from all of the, businesses that you interact with every day. Like for me, it's Nordstrom. I get a Nordstrom email and Nordstrom tells me, here's what we're doing to implement safety mechanisms to protect you in our stores as we start to phase into a reopen. So learn from each other. You can get ideas from other businesses out there that might be ways that you can afford to implement, an additional safety measure. And so, good.
Yes.
Okay.
Slide, yeah.
So on that, what do? You look at so can you open? Does the government let you? Have you thought about the safety aspect? Can you do it safely? And then what do you do with all that information? Well, you need to really build a return to work plan, or, if you're a small business owner, maybe it's just a open plan and there's no return to work necessarily. It's just you in the operation, but you really have to put that together in a plan. This is really sort of high level list that gives you some ideas of things that have to go into that plan. The stuff that we touch on in our presentation today include local government regulation. What is Alberta saying? Human resource considerations. We're going to get into that, sort of the law side of things from a human resource perspective, and safety concerns. But other things you'd look at, and Wilson touched a little bit on, is, your commercial landlord policies. So, is there a rule to actually re-enter the building? Are there rules in place that the landlord has implemented? Are there rules around maintaining cleanliness or safety imposed at the landlord level? Supply chain. So do you have access to the personal protective equipment you need, whether it's masks, gloves, whatever? And have you looked into how long it's going to take to order those things and have them implemented? That's all part of your business plan. Facilities management. So we have to think about evacuation differently. Like Wilson and I are on the 40th floor of an office tower. Well, how do you have to train your employees to be able to evacuate under normal circumstances, fire, whatever the case may be, using social distancing measures. That is all part of the plan as well. Okay, elevators. In our building, there's a limit to 3 people in an elevator. So those are the types of things you need to think about and put in a plan. The one thing I'll touch on as well is technology needs. Do you have the technology to be able to operate safely? So I think of Amex. Amex upped their credit card tap limit to $250, for example. That's one measure that they took to help protect their customers and clients, so that you no longer have to, input your PIN, but things like that. So thinking outside the box on what you can do to just make your operations a touch safer, knowing that the biggest risk is being in close proximity with other people. So, so we kind of touched a lot on this, which is you're going to look at all that information, consider all that information, and literally write it down, put it in a plan. If you need some help for an occupational health and safety continuity plan, there are resources out there. We put one on our slide, which is the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety Business Continuity Plan. So, click on that. We have a lot of hyperlinks listed in our webinar. So if you want to see a copy of the slides, let Michael know, or myself or Wilson, and we'll send them to you. Okay. The other thing you want to consider is, your goals for short-term and long-term return to work. So it's going to be a phased approach. Some companies might continue to allow people to work from home and just slowly reintegrate the workforce back into the office setting, if it is an office setting, for example. There was an article just 2 days ago that the Bank of Montreal, for example, they're actually estimating that 80%, so that's 36,000 workers, might switch to a blended home office work schedule, right? So they might not, and so that, and perhaps permanently. So what they've actually done is they've reached out to their workforce and said who wants to work from home and who doesn't. And they're trying to sort of work through that and see how much of their workforce can they actually keep at home. If that's part of your plan on how to return to operations safely, then you have to really think about developing solid policies around return to work, around working from home, right? You have to address things like expenses, equipment, ergonomics. Like, there's still a safety mechanism to ensuring that someone is working from home in a safe manner. Set out the work hours, the expectations, you know, privacy, confidentiality, that sort of thing.
So how do you actually reopen the workplace? Well, the first, most important thing you probably need is your workers back at work. We imagine for many of employers, your workers are currently on temporary layoff. So now, if you're permitted to open, you've met all those criteria, your workplace is safe, you have a business continuity plan in place, and you're ready to reopen, now is the time to issue recall notices. Recall notices have to be in writing. They have to be served on the employee, and that just means that you have to bring it to their attention, whether that's by registered mail, email, fax, although I don't know how many people actually use fax at home. Any way to get it to their attention, a phone call, but it does have to be followed up in writing. And your notice under employment standards has to state that the employee has to return within 7 days of the date the recall notice is served on the employee. Now, that doesn't mean that the recall notice has to be 7 days. The only thing that means, it could be longer or it could be shorter. The only thing that means is that past 7 days, if the employee doesn't return, potentially they could be terminated without pay or pay in lieu of notice. These requirements could change or could differ if you have a collective agreement that allows for a longer recall period or different methods for recall, as well as layoff periods. And also seniority. So if your collective agreement states who has to be recalled first, you might have to abide by that. Now, a question.
Just if anyone doesn't know, collective agreement just means that you're a unionized workforce.
Exactly. So, what happens, and this is a question I've been getting a lot, what happens if our worker employee says he doesn't want to return, she doesn't want to return, they just want to sit out for the summer? Technically, under the law, after 7 days of the recall notice, potentially they'd be terminated without pay or without notice. But what we have been saying is that the law may say one thing, but practically you might want to talk to the worker and decide and figure out why they don't want to return. It might be extenuating circumstances where you actually don't want them to return. They might be sick, they might have family responsibilities, they might have a child at home because schools are still currently closed. There might be other obligations, other considerations that you should be discussing with the workers. By being considerate and being accommodating at this point in time will only serve you and serve your best interests as you reopen. So what happens if you don't recall the workers? Well, if they're currently on temporary layoff, they would stay on temporary layoff. And the government has, okay, Lori's just giving me the time because we have a lot to go through and we only have a little bit more time. So temporary layoffs, as if employees are not recalled, they'll stay on temporary layoffs. And the Alberta government has extended the temporary layoff period from 60 days to 120 days. After the 120th day, the employee's employment is deemed to be terminated, unless, of course, you agree with the workers to extend the time of the temporary layoff period and provide some benefits or wages for that extension. Employers are no longer required to give group notices. Previously, you're required to provide group notices if you were terminating 50 or more employees. That's no longer required, but you still have to give notice to the minister as soon as practicable. And the last point is if employees are terminated, termination pay is owed. So that's both statutory pay and common law pay. Unless, of course, the contract has been frustrated or has been impossible to perform due to unforeseeable and unpreventable circumstances beyond the control of the employer. Whether or not that includes COVID-19, that remains to be seen. And of course, it would depend on the specific circumstances of your workplace. So if that is something that you want to consider, you want to terminate employees without pay, that would be something that we would say go talk to a lawyer about, or consult with a lawyer before doing so.
And so just, to sum that up, the extension to 120 days for layoff is pretty critical, because as we're working through these early stages of returning to normal operating standards, you might not be able to recall everyone at the same time. So this is going to be really helpful for you if you can recall some and not others, and being able to implement your own staged approach to full operations. A few other things that the government did to really help employers, but also employees, because there's always a safety element to it, is they temporarily remove the requirement that you have to give an employee at least 24 hours written notice of a shift change. And if your employees are working under an averaging agreement, the 2-week notice requirement. And the reason why they lifted this requirement was really to allow employers to modify schedules on a short-term basis to address safety concerns, like maybe you need to stagger shifts at the last minute, or maybe you have one employee out due to COVID-19 symptoms and you need to institute someone else back in or modify the shifts. Similarly, they also may streamline the process for variances and exemptions. So really what that means is if your workplace needs a change in the employment standards rules to be able to operate during this tricky time during COVID-19, you can actually apply to the, depending on what it is, the director or the minister, to get a variance. And they've made that process a lot easier for employers. So an example where we're seeing this a lot right now is, some employers in the oil sands are moving to longer days, or are increasing the day rotation. Instead of 10 days on, 10 days off, they're working 16 on, 16 off, to really limit the amount of time that employees are spending during shift change and in front of each other.
So the last question that you have to consider is, what are other issues that come to mind that you have to be wary of, or that you should be aware of as you reopen the workplace? The first is privacy issues. So your privacy obligations haven't changed. You still should be mindful. The next slide.
Sorry, my apologies.
That's okay. Something popped up.
Yes.
So you should be mindful that the privacy obligations that you had prior to COVID-19 still apply. You have a duty to protect the confidential information of all your employees. You can only collect, use, or disclose information to the extent that it's reasonably necessary to affect the employment relationship. So what that means is you should consider privacy obligations when you're accommodating employees that are returning back to work, whether or not you're doing temperature checks of employees when they're coming into the workplace, contact tracing, which just basically means if someone's infected, there's an app of the people that they've been around and the information around that. And one of the biggest questions that we have is disclosure of infection or sickness in the workplace. So if someone is sick in the workplace, can you actually disclose that information to the other employees? Well, there is an exception under the Privacy Act that you are able to disclose information or collect or use if there is a situation or emergency that jeopardizes the health, safety, safety or security. I was trying to remember the last one of other employees, or other members of the public, or your clients. So you can disclose that information, but what we would say is anonymize it. Make sure that it doesn't get, if you don't have to disclose who that individual is, or there's a way that you can disclose information, but don't have to disclose too much medical information or any information about that employee, that's the best way to affect that.
So a very simple example is you have an employee that says, hey, I have an underlying risk factor. I can't work reception anymore because it's front facing, or I can't be in the office at all anymore. Other workers are going to know, okay, well, what happened to Judy? Judy's not at the front desk anymore. Judy's at home. It's okay to say Judy's at home because she has an underlying health condition, maybe. But you don't need to say Judy's at home because she has MS, or Judy's at home because she has lung disease, or whatever the case may be. So you're only sharing the information that's reasonably necessary to explain, to be able to move forward and protect the safety of others.
Make sure you talk to legal counsel though.
Yeah.
Before doing any of the steps, before, committing to too many actions, I think. And this is a blurry slide.
Yeah, so on the human rights side of things, this is a pretty big one, right? We do have human rights protections in Alberta, and employers have human rights obligations that go with that. You can't discriminate against someone on the basis of physical disability, whether they actually have a disability or you think they do. So that, in the COVID context, that's someone with symptoms or someone that's actually sick. Place of origin or race is also something that comes up in the COVID-19 context, unfortunately, particularly in the early stages where it was seen to be sort of an Asian issue or a Chinese issue, and we'd see some unfortunate discriminatory conduct as a result of that. But the big one coming from going into return to work, reopening, is going to be family status. We think we're going to see a lot of claims in this area, especially due to childcare and elder care concerns. You have to remember when we showed that slide, the slide of the different phases, we're only going to see limited daycare and summer camp openings potentially as early as next week. But of course, it's going to really depend on whether those daycares and summer camps can implement all the safety controls. We're not talking about schools opening until the next stage, and probably not until September. So there's going to be a lot of workers that actually can't work because they have to stay at home and continue to care for their kids. And so you do have an obligation as an employer to accommodate that employee to the point of undue hardship. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily, it means that you might have to consider other alternatives. Can the employee work from home? Can the employee work different hours? I get a lot of my work done these days after 8 p.m. when my 1-year-old goes to bed. That's fine in my workforce. Is that okay in yours, right? Can the employee use vacation or banked time or take an unpaid leave of absence? So those are the things that you might want to think about. And if it's a very temporary nature until September, maybe you can afford an unpaid leave of absence. So those are the kinds of considerations. There's a specific legal test that sets out your obligations. I won't go into it because it can be a little bit confusing, but the point is, if the employee has that responsibility and they've made reasonable efforts to find an alternative solution and just can't, you may have an obligation here to accommodate that person.
So as absenteeism is going to be a huge issue whenever people return back to work. Workers just aren't all going to be able to go back to work all at the same time.
Yeah. So on that, that's the human rights element. Employment standards has also put in, the government has also put in some temporary employment standards, requirements for employers around these issues. So an employee is actually entitled to unpaid job protected. So although it's unpaid, it is job protected leave if they're at home continuing to care for children affected by school or daycare closure or a family member under quarantine. It's retroactive to March 17th. And it's the leave itself is flexible in length. And this temporary change is in place, and at least currently, until August 14th, unless the government changes that date. Similarly, we have COVID-19 leave, which is 14 days of unpaid job protected leave for employees required to self-isolate or self-quarantine as a result of COVID-19. And the self-isolation requirements I've put on the slide here for you as well. So that's if an employee has either traveled internationally or been in close contact with a confirmed case or has symptoms of COVID-19, they're going to be required to isolate in accordance with the Chief Medical Officer of Health's recommendations. We saw on that early slide, that's going to continue throughout all stages of this return to work plan. That's not going away, and employees are going to be entitled to job protected leave if they have to stay home to reduce the spread. And an employee could have multiple instances of this leave if they continually get sick or symptoms of COVID-19.
So workers' compensation, this slide's only to remind you that workers' compensation is still available if a worker contracts COVID-19 in the workplace or the nature of employment has led them to be exposed to COVID-19. If you don't have WCB coverage because you're in an industry where you could elect to have it or not, we would certainly say that now would be a good time to consider WCB coverage. And if you currently have it and a worker does get sick, you do have to report it because it is injury or illness that has happened in the workplace. There is a link there for more information about WCB. WCB continues to apply for workers that are working from home.
So OHS work refusals, this is also really important. So this is where an employee has the right to refuse work under the Occupational Health and Safety Act if there is a dangerous condition and duties are present or duties present a danger to the health and safety of that worker outside of normal working conditions, right? So if an employee is refusing to come to work, you would it's important to note that not every refusal triggers an occupational health and safety work refusal. You have to get at the source of what the refusal is about. So if it's because they have an underlying condition or a childcare issue, that's a human rights issue potentially, right? We talked about how to handle that. Here we're talking about something different. Like if someone is saying, hey, you are not giving me the appropriate protective equipment because I am a front-facing employee, for example. So this might be a grocery store clerk that doesn't have the right, personal protective equipment, something like that. You as an employer have the obligation to investigate the employee's concerns, and if the employee's concerns are reasonable or fair or however you're correct, you have to implement measures to eliminate that hazard, right? And all the while you're figuring it out, you got to continue to pay that employee. So that's the important thing to remember there under your obligations. There are lots of resources to help you. The provincial government has, the key one there is really the second one under the Alberta government website, which is the Workplace Guidance for Business Owners. It's this one here. The next two slides go through a number of resources, but I like this one best because it actually hyperlinks you to some of the other sources on the slide itself. And it's being updated as we move through these phases.
So we're going to go through this topic very quickly because I do see it's 10:45. We can probably stay a little bit later, but we do want to be able to get to your questions.
And be respectful of your time too.
Of course, especially since today is still work day, even if you're working from home. As you may know, the government has provided a number of different programs in place with various different acronyms. And to be fair, I think these acronyms are probably worse than Elon Musk and Grimes' second child. So they are very confusing, and these programs that have been put in place are, been put in place in a very rapid pace in order to make sure that workers are able to get assistance and employers are able to get assistance right away. So to be fair, I think there's a reason why so many came out so quickly, but they are kind of been rolled out in a very haphazard kind of way.
And you might qualify for more than one, which is key. So just because you apply for one doesn't mean you don't qualify or apply for the other. So starting with the Canada Emergency Business Account, this is basically an interest-free loan of up to $40,000 for small business owners. It's really important to apply if you qualify for a number of reasons. One, it's going to help you with your operational costs during COVID-19. And to qualify, you need to be able to demonstrate that you paid payroll for 2019 between at least $20,000 or $1.5 million. But the key thing here, right, is that if you repay this loan before December 31st of 2022, a quarter of it's forgiven. That's $10,000. So it's a pretty significant amount of money in pocket if you are able to use it in the interim and repay it on time. The Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program is going to be really important for those that are in the commercial renting commercial space, of course. This is a forgivable loan for commercial property owners, and it's available to cover half of the rent for April, May, and June of 2020. What this basically is a rent share agreement between the landlord, commercial tenant, and the federal provincial government. And the way it works is that the landlord has to reduce rent for the tenant by at least 75%. And if they do that, effectively what happens is the tenant will pay 25% of the rent, the landlord will pay the other 25% of the rent, and the federal and provincial government will share the cost of the remaining half of the rent to cover all of it. This is based on fixed costs, so it's not going to cover landlord profits.
So the temporary wage subsidy was a very early program that the government, probably one of the first programs the federal government had put in place to address COVID-19. And quite simply, this program provides 10% of eligible remuneration of employees. That means the pay that you provide employees as a subsidy that the government returns to you, provided that you pay the employees during the months of March 18, 2020 to June 19, 2020. So the maximum amount is $1,375 per employee or $25,000 per employer. This subsidy is provided in the form of a reduction in the remittances that you pay to the government. So that's EI, CPP, and you don't have to apply for this wage subsidy. It actually is considered when you're doing your deducting income tax, it's reduced during the time when you're remitting that to the government. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is, in many ways, usurped I'm going to go back to look at the acronyms, Temporary Wage Subsidy, TWS. It provides up to 75 wages of, the government refunds you up to 75% of the wages that you pay employees between the months of March 15th to June 16th, provided that you're an eligible employer. And if we can just go to the next slide, what an eligible employer is there, and it basically includes almost every entity, a corporate entity under the sun. So unless you're a public institution, which is a school, a hospital, school board, you will likely be eligible, provided you meet the other various criterias, which includes a reduction in revenue. So there is a very quick snapshot of the various reductions in revenues that you have to meet. So for March 15th to April 11th, provided that you've experienced a loss of 15% in revenue, either year over year, that means March compared back to March, April compared back to April, or compared between an average of January and February, you will likely qualify for the subsidy. And if you qualify for one period, you automatically qualify for the next period. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 deal in that sense.
The other thing to note here, though, it's not an immediate cash injection. So what this is it gets sort of credited to you at come tax time for your corporation. So you're not going to see an immediate cash injection to cover off your wages, but it is going to help. You will see it come out in the wash at the end and maybe turn into a refund at that stage.
Yeah, and it could also be applied retroactively. So if your employees were laid off during that period of time, you could actually rehire them and pay them retroactively for a time that they've been on temporary layoff, and then apply for the program. Now, this is the formula, and it's quite complicated under the Income Tax Act, because this is a piece of legislation under the Income Tax Act. I'm not going to go through the whole criteria because that's going to take much longer than the time that we have left, but there is a calculator available on the government website that walks you through how those calculations are done. The important thing to note here is that if the employee's on paid leave, you will be able to get reimbursed the full cost of EI and CPP contributions.
Okay, this is me and I skipped ahead. So the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, this is what many individuals are benefiting from right now across the country, which is $2,000 a month for a maximum of 4 months for workers who aren't working due to COVID-19. It also includes self-employed individuals. So this is the key sort of benefit that most people that aren't working right now are taking advantage of. It runs from the period of March 15th to October 3rd, but you can only collect a maximum of 16 weeks of that entitlement. And the applications have been open since April 6th.
Because we're presenting here because of Bow Valley College, we also thought we would include the new Canada Emergency Student Benefit. This is very similar to CERB in the sense that students, including high school students and post-secondary students and recent graduates who are not eligible for CERB, or EI, because they haven't received any income or they weren't working the previous year, they will be able to apply for a fixed sum of $1,250 per month for up to 4 months. If they are a student with a disability or dependents, they will receive an additional $750 per month. So how do these three different programs interact? Well, for CERB and CEWS, or CEWS? I don't know.
The wage subsidy.
The wage subsidy. There are different criteria that are almost diametrically opposed to each other. So for CERB, you can't have any income more than $1,000 for 14 consecutive days within the 4-week period. For CEWS, you can have an employee that hasn't been paid by you for a 4-week period. So that should avoid a lot of the double dipping. Having said that, there are cases where that just doesn't apply. An employee receives both CERB and CEWS. In that case, employees will be required to repay CERB if they do not meet the eligibility requirements.
On the different note, looking at that from a more positive, like a different perspective, is that an employee can actually earn some income while getting the Canada Emergency Response benefit. So if you can only recall workers for a short period of time or for project-based work, as long as they're not earning more than that $1,000 in income over 14 consecutive days in the month that they're receiving the emergency benefit, they can get some income, right?
Yeah.
And so the work sharing program, all we'll say about this one is that effectively it's a program to help avoid layoffs. So employees basically agree to work a reduced schedule and share hours with each other over a period and get topped up by EI. They've implemented some streamlined requirements to allow these applications to get processed quicker and for longer periods of time. And deferred premiums, this is pretty big. So premiums for all businesses for workers' compensation have been deferred until 2021. And if you are a small or medium-sized business, you're only going to owe half of your WCB premiums. The government is going to cover the rest. That's pretty huge. And so all we have to say now is just make sure you stay up to date. The best sources are government sources. News articles are great, but they don't always cover everything accurately. So go with the Government of Alberta website, watch the press conferences put on by the Premier or Justin Trudeau, and also, look at our website because we do consolidate a lot of information there that's quite helpful.
I'm quite proud of our website, actually. We update on a daily basis. You get sent in a flash updates every single day. So not to toot our own horn, but one of the best ways to get informed is by subscribing to us.
Yeah. And on that note, we have a very limited time for question and answer, but we're happy to stay longer. Sorry about that, Michael.
I'm actually happy that we went through it.
Oh, no problem. No problem. That was great. No. Hey, Lori Wilson, thank you so much for all that information. I mean, there's lots and lots of great resources out there, and it really is important to know what is out there to support you guys, whether you're a business, whether you're an employee, or even as a customer, so that you know how you can stay safe and what these obligations for businesses are, so that you know that you're going into the right place and that you won't contract anything. So we are going to take maybe a couple questions. So what you guys can do is pop it into the chat there. Now, Lori mentioned that if you do want the slides, then she'll send it to me. So I'm going to put my email there in the chat and then take note of it, or you've got their emails there as well. And then I can send it out to you. But if you do have a question, then feel free to pop it into the chat or even raise your hand here, and then we'll get to you on those questions. But I mean, why don't I start it off here? I do have a question for you guys. Now, when you hear of places that have had outbreaks, and maybe this is coming more from the customer's point of view. Now, so for example, like let's say a grocery store has an outbreak, and then they say in the news that they did a deep clean. Then legally, I mean, what kinds of things are they required to do? And what counts as a deep clean, or what does that kind of look like? Now, I'm also going to preface this as well and say that, Lori and Wilson are, there's certain things that they can't answer as well, right? So, I mean, feel free to say that, pass on this one or something like that if, you're not able to.
I think we can provide some context for you, Michael. It's a really good question because where is your level of confidence that it's okay for that business to reopen? I can tell you at least right now at this phase, where there's an outbreak, those businesses are working very closely with Alberta Health Services and the Chief Medical Officer of Health, who's providing recommendations and guidelines on what they need to do in order to allow them to reopen in those circumstances. So you can be at least assured that there is an added layer. It's not just the grocery store deciding on their own. And of course, when they say they've done a deep clean, I think what we're talking about is a bacterial clean of all, all surfaces that a person could come into contact with. But they're going to be required to at least meet minimum criteria set by the government in order to open back up to the public.
And I think that's where your hazard assessment really comes in. Like, how often are people going through your workplace? Or are you a grocery store that's exposed to the public every single day? Well, the criteria for a deep clean is probably much higher than, one cleaning per day. If you're a small office like us and, maybe one person goes in per day, maybe a wipe down by whoever's using the equipment. We're going to wipe that stuff down after.
That's what our cleaning supplies are here for. The interesting thing is you're probably actually safer after an outbreak because at least Alberta Health Services has come in and provided guidance. That's the unusual thing about it. A lot of employers now are just trying to figure it out for themselves without having that additional opportunity to get the guidance.
Oh, that's great. So we've got a question here from Ed. What constitutes an individual being considered to be in an at-risk group?
So I think at risk right now, it's listed on the Government of Alberta website. I think what it means is if you are, is it 60 years or older? And in addition, if you have any underlying respiratory conditions, so it could be something like lung disease, I think diabetes qualifies. So check out the Government of Alberta resources, but those are individuals with underlying health conditions that make them more susceptible to contract a severe case of COVID-19.
Okay, great. And we've got another one from Vipin here now. I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but he's wondering what the plan B for businesses and government is if there is an outbreak when people go back to work.
Well, I think what Premier Kenney has said is that this is more of a dimmer switch as opposed to an on and off switch. So we're not all opening at once, and they're going to be reassessing the risk factors at every single stage. So if there is an outbreak and we start rolling backwards, then the restrictions are come back in place, and businesses are going to be required to close again or take more preventative measures to make sure that we don't have a full-blown outbreak or a second wave, as they say.
And that's what makes the business continuity plan so important. Identifying your key roles within your organization, your key functions, and how you're going to be nimble enough to be able to shut down and reopen literally at the drop of a hat, because that's what happened 2 months ago. And now we have the opportunity of learning from that and putting it down to paper and having a plan in place so that if we go through it again, the impact might not be as bad.
Okay. No, that's perfect. And I mean, you guys mentioned a couple of things, and you always have to stay up to date, right? So we do have a little bit more of a comment here from Vipin. COVID-19 is a hidden enemy and we are not ready to confront it. I believe as long as we are not ready and there is no vaccine, we will be living in fear. It's going to be tricky and confident to start. We may have another option to follow Sweden's model to develop herd immunity. And you know what? In the end, Vipin, it's all about working together, right? It's all about coming together to fight this, whatever it is, listening to our leaders, listening to the experts and coming together. So that's why it's great to get more information like this from people like Lori, people from Wilson. And, we've had a lot of other community leaders who have come in to do webinars with us this past month. So just like those ones, we're going to have this recording. We have this recorded and we're going to post this up so that you can look at it again, because there are lots and lots of resources that we went through today. So check out the recording. We'll put it on our website, mycareerconnection.ca. You can look at our events page to check out the past events and past webinars that we've had, and then we'll have the recordings on there as well. But I want to thank you guys so much. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Wilson. That was lots of amazing stuff. You guys were talking about always keeping up to date with what's going on up there, staying up to date with the news conferences and all those updates on what's happening. And definitely check out the Mathews Dinsdale website, because Wilson said this is a top-notch, up-to-date website. So that's awesome. Now, if let's say businesses have some questions and want to get your help, how can they contact you guys?
Just shoot us an email and we're happy to answer questions or point you in the right direction. Of course, if it teeters on actual legal advice, we'll set up a proper retainer to do that. But if you need some guidance, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to, put you to resources that can assist.
And we do have a 24/7 hotline as well as a 24/7 monitor email.
I'll put that number back up for you guys. There you go.
All right, perfect. So check that out if you do know anybody, or if you are that business that does need that help, then contact Lori or Wilson, and they can see what they can do to help you out. So thank you guys so much for coming in. But let me tell you about what's happening tomorrow. Now, tomorrow is our last webinar. It's been almost a month, and it has been super busy and an amazing month of webinars with community leaders and organizations and really, really smart people like Lori and Wilson here today. And there's so much information that was brought up, and it may have been difficult to put all that stuff together. So tomorrow, for our last one, I'm going to be putting a nice little bow on everything so that you can have that effective job search. Now, to bring your notes, bring your questions, because I'll be answering all those questions. I'm going to be, kind of talking about all the things that we've talked about in the past month. And I'm going to bring all that experience from my recruitment background, as well as my career coaching background, as well as also from just interviewing and talking to lots and lots of these leaders personally in the HR industry. So come check that one out. If you don't have the link, or you need to register for that, check out our website at mycareerconnection.ca/events. But thank you so much one more time to Lori and Wilson. My name is Michael Manzano, and I'm with Career Connection at Bow Valley College. And everyone, remember to stay safe, stay strong, because we're going to get through this together. Have a great day, everyone. You take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.